Hi everyone. This is a video that walks through a very basic Schenkerian diagram of the third movement from Mozart's K545 Piano Sonata in C major. So I've copied the music out here on the top of my sheet, and I'm going to go ahead and drop in an audio file so we can listen to it. So when we're working on a Schenker diagram here, remember that one of the first things you'll do is actually to carry out a fairly conventional analysis of the work. So this is an antecedent consequent period, right? It starts here, it goes to a half cadence there, and then it starts over with slight variation immediately here, taking us to a perfect authentic cadence at the end of the phrase. So that's going to be the framework of a Schenker diagram. We're going to show how this piece begins with the tonic, how it goes to 5 via a predominant in the previous measure, and how it begins again on the tonic. Takes us once again through predominant, but this time to dominant and tonic. So immediately we know that we can fill these moments in and that they're going to give the structure to our diagram. Now, this is an example that comes out of the Fort-Gilbert Introduction to Schenkerian Analysis, and I'm going to follow a couple of the things that they recommend. Number one, they discuss the notion of an implied tone. They talk about how this is clearly tonic harmony in the beginning and in the pickup to measure 5, yet there's no bass note, and they suggest that we add a bass note in parentheses down here at the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the register in which it might happen. And I'll put that in parentheses. And then the same thing right here as we begin our second half, another bass note in parentheses. Now, as we know from the structure of a Schenkerian diagram, that's going to go to 5 here. And this one is going to go 5, 1. Let's just keep things up here. So we know that we've got 1 going to 5, 1, 5, or really 5, 7 to 1. In fact, I'll throw that on. Now, from there, we want to think about the predominant. Right here, for example, we have F in the bass very prominently, scale degree 4 going up to 5. In this case, scale degree 4 goes up to 5 via a little 2 to 5, a little interpolated fifth there. If we look at the notes we have here, we've clearly got A, D, and F outlining the 2-6 chord, which then goes to 2 for this last little moment, and is going to leap up to F. So in my conventional analysis, I might say that that is our harmony for measure 3, and I might especially focus on these chord tones that I'm sort of making bolder there. Let the rest of them be passing tones or chromatic passing tones as we seek to outline this harmony in some form. I'm skipping one of the steps here that Fort and Gilbert talk about, which is to sort of do a full rhythmic reduction of this at the quarter note level. You can imagine, for example, you're going to leave out things like the repeated notes here. You're going to reduce this to E and G on that beat, A and C on that beat, and so forth. I'm not going to do that, although when I highlight the notes that we actually are interested in, that is to some degree what I'm doing. The same thing, for example, might go in this measure, where D there is a passing tone between C and E that are part of the chord. Right, let's fill in just a bit more here. So for example, we have 2/6 happening at the end, a similar deal where C sharp is an incomplete lower neighbor, D and F are really the chord tones. We even, in fact, pick up just a tiny shade of C natural there. I'll call this a 2/6/5 to note the presence of that note. And then here in the last eighth note, you've got B and D going down to C. So finally, I can fill in, a couple of additional little harmonies here. We're prolonging 1 through to 1/6. So that's something that we're going to want to prominently show on our diagram. And that goes via a little 4/6 to a 4 to a 5. So remember, we're going to mostly de-emphasize those in-between chords. We're going to look at this all as prolongation of the tonic. And there's something similar going on here. We've got 1 being prolonged all the way now to a root position 1. 5 here. This measure is slightly different. A, C, and E shows us that it goes to 6. D, F, F and A. It goes to a little root position 2 chord. It's giving us, a little bit of a sequence through root position chords there, 6, 2, 5, 1. But as I said, we're going to think of this as prolonging 1, and that's going to help us to structure our diagram. So, let me finish off the bass by including our predominant, and I'm going to call this big 4 the predominant. Now, for Schenker, this doesn't get to connect to that structure on this level, but it is a very important pitch here. So I'm going to show our little D there with an unstemmed note head going across. And the other thing is this interesting little looping predominant here. And at a higher level, I'll leave this D out to let the diagram look a little bit cleaner. It's a little bit, the slurs are overlapping a little bit here in a suboptimal way. So when I do our final level down at the bottom of the page, I'm definitely going to leave that out. Remember, we want to avoid kind of things being slurred across one another. We want to have a very clear hierarchical structure, just like they do in GTTM. Here, that's a little bit easier. There's no additional note. We're going to go from the tonic up to there, and we're going to slur the predominant to the dominant. There. Now, we've got some space. In fact, I may end up erasing and modifying these slurs because we want to make a little bit of space for what happens in between. This one doesn't loop down as low as the first one does, and it's going to get in our way. I'll reconnect that later. So we're going to represent these notes on some level. But right now I'm going to leave them as stemless note heads until I reach E there, because this is really the prolongation that we're going to be interested in. Is this C going down to E? That gets a stem. We'll very likely connect it via a slur, but we'll worry about that later. In the top voice, we have a little bit of guidance from Fort and Gilbert. They suggest that we sketch this as a 5-line meaning that we start from the 5th scale degree, or G, going G, F, E, D for the interruption over 5, and then restarting after the interruption with G, F, E, D, and C is going to land there at the tonic. So I'm not 100% convinced by that. I could definitely hear this being a 3-line if we emphasized this, although that gives us some sort of unaligned things. You have to work a little bit of contrapuntal magic to hear it that way. Or I'd even be willing to hear this 3. I find 3s in general to be a little bit more convincing than a lot of 5 lines, particularly for a very short excerpt like this. There are some Schenkerians that have very strong feelings about this, one way or the other, that a certain piece of music definitely has to be a 5-line, or for example, Charles Smith, one of the people that I studied with, would say there's just not enough music here for it to be a 5-line. It must be a 3 no matter what note is more prominent. But we're going to sketch this as a 5 for now. And so I'm going to give a kind of note against note counterpoint. I'll go ahead and preserve both notes there. In general, I'm going with the outer voices. And I'm going to show all of these notes just to have them. So we know that we need to find our 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that in general, our 5 and our 3 are going to be supported by tonic. Our 2 is going to go over the dominant, so we know that it should come right there. And our 4 is, always the difficult note to account for, the unsupported stretch, which in this case we're going to find in between our pretty clear 5 and 3. So I'm going to say that we've got 5 here, 4, 3. I find that to be pretty convincing. It follows the pattern of the music. But as we're looking for our 5, we're going to notice that it's missing. This D here is part of the 2/6, so I'm not going to say that that's the 5. I'm going to say that our 5 is implied, just like this tonic 1 was implied. Sorry, it's not a 5, it's a 2. So that's sort of the general structure. We'll give this a little bit of interpretation, and we'll say that this E is coming off of there, this D is coming off of there. That's sort of following the way that this music unfolds by third. Ba, 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 ba. Then we'll collapse these together. This one I'm not going to stem across because really it's sort of coming across there. One thing we might do with this, and Fort Gilbert tell us explicitly to do this, that this note can be heard as a little bit of an upper neighbor note. And in this case, it's an incomplete upper neighbor note because we don't get our tonic back. But one way to account for what's going on here is that we're going to stem this A up to there. Remember, we want to have everything connected in some way in order to give this some shape. You don't want sort of hanging notes that aren't part of a large slur or connected to a stemmed note in some way. So we're just fine with these big structural notes, but I kind of want to mirror that unfolding of the 1 chord. And I'm going to say that this G is going down to that E. I'm going to give this a stem since it's a root position chord. It's sort of counterpointing the 4 there, and the A as the 4/6 chord is dependent upon that root position sonority. So we've got a little bit of interpretation on everything, and one of the nice things about a Schenkerian analysis, as opposed to the bracket-based generative theory of tonal music sort of prolongational analysis, is that we can show these voices independently. We can see that there's something going on in the counterpoint. There's this little imitative thing that passes from hand to hand. You have the eighth, I was going to say quarter, but it's eighth as well, dun, 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 and that overlaps with dun, dun, dun. So you can kind of see visually that these gestures go down a third, overlapping, down a third, overlapping, down a third, overlapping. And this kind of leaps in and reasserts itself. And the passage changes a little bit in the third measure going into the fourth measure. That's how I'll sketch the first half. And so, as we know, we can very frequently sketch consequent phrases in a period in a kind of similar way. So I'm going to start in the same way with our G here. This is an interesting moment that Fort and Gilbert highlight. They sort of want to say that this A is an upper neighbor note to G, which is really more proper than that little neighbor note I identified there. Upper neighbor note, which they give a stem and the N notation here to G, and in the same moment that F is 4. So the best way I can think of to show that is for them to kind of be linked together, either with a slur or with a sort of unfolding diagram, which would be a little stem and a kind of upward thing. I don't find that to work very well in this case, so I'm going to let it be a slur. So I've got 5, don't quite have the space here, 4, 3 happens slightly differently. I'm going to omit the A and the F there, call G and E my important notes, and sort of normalize their rhythm here. I'm also going to say this D and B are sort of dependent on that again, where we have 5 going to 1. Here I've got A, slightly different motion, to D on the root, G down to C. I'll slur this over here. G goes to C. Let's just show this progression there. Really, I'm not sure that I want to put a stem on that note, but it works to kind of show us A goes to D, and in a very similar way, G goes to C in the next measure. It has a nice level of structure for this level of detail. Again, that's going to be omitted as we do our final bit of diagramming. Finally, I might like to show this D right at the very end is our 2, and that's going to pass to 1. Give all of these little scale degree carets that I had forgotten. There we go. Here I kind of want to honor the predominant and the way that it's written. So I'm going to give this a little tiny stem, let that go, and then show that we have our leading tone sort of in the picture as well. B goes up to D, which is the scale degree 2, that descends to C. The leading tone kind of helps it to surround that. So this is a pretty decent Schenker diagram. I've forgotten one note here. I want to keep emphasizing the descending thirds bit, which this is kind of nice that it shows how the descending third is a little bit different in the second half. There we've put our thirds together. And we have it there. We have an inversion of those thirds as we approach the predominant to dominant to tonic. So I'm fairly happy with that as a diagram that sort of shows this level of structure. The nice thing about a Schenkerian diagram also is that it's playable. So I'm going to go over to the piano. So here we are with those implied parenthetical C's in the bass, and we've got our 5 there above it. Okay, let's throw this in the register as written. And let's see how this sounds. There's the really important note. And then back to this again. So I would say that that sounds a lot like the actual piece, and that helps me to think that we've got a pretty good little interpretation of this period. So finally, the last thing that I want to do to kind of show you how you will cope with the next level of structure down is to just sketch kind of the bare minimum. When you start to work at these deeper middle ground or getting into the background sort of layers in Schenkerian analysis, it's another strength of the method. You know, we can sort of look at the counterpoint in a stripped down way, we can look for prolongations and de-emphasize the things in between. But one of the useful things of this level of sketching is that you can start to prepare to look at the phrase in the context of the larger work. So I'm just going to throw that in here, but I'm going to generally omit the bar lines. Here, I'm going to represent the fact that we're dealing with the beginning of the work. That's our opening tonic, and on a large scale, a lot of people will represent this by sort of leaving the large flag there. Oops, that should be an open note head. That's better. And I'll show a large flag that goes there, and then just kind of trails off, and that's going to be in effect for a long, long time. So then I've got filled note heads that are going to show me my big level of structure here. This one's a filled note head in the bass, and it's going to connect, you know, on a smaller level. This is one of those practices that comes about in, post-Schenkerism. A lot of his diagrams don't actually do things like this, at least in free composition. You know, he experiments with a lot of different sort of bracket structures. But this is kind of the way that sketching has developed in American Schenkerism. There we go. There's our same idea, and we're going to call these all filled note heads because they're all subsidiary to that large open note head, which this 5 will eventually go to a 4, 3, 2, 1, you know, at the end of the movement. We have our interruption there. And this is all going to go like this. So that really is our sort of next level of structure down. One thing that I would often like to do is I like to include the predominant, just to give the phrase a little bit of shape, to kind of show us how it works. And, you know, you would classically add the slur here, kind of going like that. I guess I will go ahead and throw that in there because it looks pretty good that way. Just looping slur and the predominant to dominant slur under it. And there we go. That's really our sort of deep middle ground sketch of this passage. Add my last flag up there. And there we go. That's how I put something like this together. Remember, it proceeds from traditional analysis. You can't just start by copying notes down and say, oh, that looks like the 5 or the 3 or the 2, and, you know, that looks like it goes in nice counterpoint. You really have to sort of
deal with the chords as they're written. You have to do a lot of really traditional analysis to understand the individual chords, the harmonic functions, the way that the two voices might line up, and then from there you can go into your Schenkerian sort of contrapuntal / prolongational analysis.